This is James Katigan for the Living Legend Library, and we're today interviewing Mr. Rex Evans of Tulsa for the Tulsa State Fair. Mr. Evans, let's begin this interview on this first day of September 1971 by you giving us and bringing us up on your background as when you arrived in Tulsa and something about your early childhood.
The Frisco train brought me into Tulsa March the 10th, 1908. The one thing I remember very vividly was that there were a number of Indians on this train, and having heard about the wild Indians back in Missouri, my one thought was, I hope they get off before I do, or that they get off and they don't take me with them. But somehow or another they didn't seem to bother, and we went on to our new home at the corner of 9th and Cheyenne, which at that time was the edge of town. Life went on as it would for a 6-year-old youngster, rather uneventful. I probably got into many scrapes and, of course, met the neighborhood children, which, like I had been, had come from various and sundry surrounding states. Along in the summer of that year, I went to kindergarten, which was conducted in the basement of the First Methodist Church at the corner, northeast corner of 4th and Boulder, which later was torn down and made way for the Pythian building. Now, whether I learned very much at school is debatable, but I went. Then, on the 14th day of September 1908, which was a rainy morning, the Lindsay School opened for the fall term. This was the first day that the school was opened, and we assembled there not knowing what school would be like, but we looked forward to recess. At that time, this was at the very edge of town. The cornfield adjoined the school to the south. Beyond that, there were 2 or 3 houses before you got to the river. So we had an ideal place for our playground, and one of the things that I remembered so well was when we went out away from home was to be careful that the gypsies didn't get us. The early years were, of course, very eventful. At that time, we were all what today would be considered in the poverty group, but fortunately we didn't know the difference, so we thought we were all right.
Mr. Evans, in those early school days, what was the athletics like during this time? Did you play baseball, football, and volleyball the same as we do now?
Baseball was the big sport, and in those days we wound our ball with twine. Then we put tape around it to keep the cord from becoming unraveled. And the baseball diamond would be wherever there was a vacant lot. If somebody came along, interfered with that, and built a house, we would go on down ways farther and start another diamond. But the best diamond that we knew of around town was at the corner of 7th and Main. There were signboards on both the Main Street side as well as the 7th, so it made an ideal backstop. Among those who participated at that time was the late Dale Carter, who was one of the most eminent lumbermen here in town. And later in high school, he was the only one whom I have known who had the distinction of having 16 letters in the major sports going through high school. Earlier, our youth was spent in the cave, which at that time ran from 11th and Denver on south, following what is now 11th Street to Indian. Then it ran on, took an angle there, and ran to the river. And in this cave, we always managed to do a little digging, and we'd always get our shinny clubs, because shinny was a very important game at that time. The puck, as we knew it then, was an old pet milk can, and after it is hammered up real good, was used until it finally wore out for the target. The clubs were always taken out of some crooked young tree, which would be ideal with a hook on it. And this afforded us many hours of pleasure.
Mr. Evans, can you remember and relate to us some of the incidents that might have happened to you and some of your classmates in the early part of your school days?
In the first grade, there were several of us who still live here in Tulsa. One that I have kept up with very closely through those years is Ike Holmes. We are still good friends after the many years from 1908 on. And I see a good many of the classmates that were in Lindsay, which name was later changed to Riverview. For instance, there is Ira Cruz, one of the very prominent lumbermen. Walton Clinton, whose uncle was instrumental in the first well that was drilled in Red Fork. My brother, Dr. Hugh Evans, who is retired eye, ear, nose, and throat physician. I could go on naming a good many who are still around. But going back to 1910, we were most fortunate in having our new principal, who had come from Arizona. His name was William Hackendorf. He was a very fair man, but he was quite firm. And bear in mind that in those days we had the elite of the town, which came from over on Boulder Avenue, as well as those who came from along the riverfront, as well as many of us who were more or less middle class, I would say. But through Mr. Hackendorf, he taught us so many of the things that didn't go along in the school books, such as character building. And I am certain that many who otherwise would have dropped out of school had they not had his wonderful training, they would not have been the useful citizens that they turned out to be. Now, finally, some of us, in fact, the majority of us, got to high school, which for us was in the fall of 1916. We were in the Tulsa High School, and that at that time, except for the Holy Family School, were the only two high schools in Tulsa. That was located on the blocks between 4th and 5th and Boston and Cincinnati. This sat near the center of the block, but we still had room in front of the building, which faced west, for our indoor baseball games, as well as in the fall of the year we'd have our tournaments. And the rivalry of the various grade schools in those days was quite intense. In fact, at the end of the game, and there weren't a few fights, why, it was a very tame affair. Now, later, we went to the new building, which is the present Central High School. But in those days, it was known only as Tulsa High School. So after a few eventful years in high school, I went on to Missouri University. By 1924, I thought I'd acquired a little knowledge, and I had a job down at Slick, Oklahoma, which is almost a ghost town today, but back from 1917 until along in the 30s was a very busy oil field town. My job was keeping track of the supplies in a warehouse, keeping time, and so on and so forth. After reading many of the ads in the magazines at that time, advertising the Davy Tree Expert Company. Now, the only thing that interested me was that they said one would travel. They did mention a little work, but that was insignificant because I didn't pay any attention to it. I wanted to get in something where I could travel. So on the 24th, in June of 24, I remember it was Friday the 13th of June that I left here, went to Cleveland, Ohio, and started my career as a tree surgeon. We were on the shore of Lake Erie, and after that first day, if I had had the fare to have come on back to Oklahoma, I think they would have never had me as a tree surgeon. But I was broke, so I stayed. And it has been very rewarding because I did travel and see very much of the eastern states, particularly the New England area. And then, after a few years, I came back to Tulsa and have been in that business largely since that time.
Mr. Evans, when you returned to Tulsa, it certainly must have been with a lot of misgivings and a lot of faith in Tulsa. How did you find things in Tulsa on your return here?
In the intervening years, after having been back east with the Davy Company, I had lived in St. Louis, and of course found a girl there that I thought I couldn't live without, and I haven't for almost 43 years. We had lived in Detroit because that seemed to be the promised land back before the Depression. But while we were there in October of 1929, the Depression hit, and it was a rough go. So after a year or two there, we came on back to Tulsa, which hadn't really developed into the soup line period that we left Detroit in. But it wasn't many months until jobs were as scarce as hen's teeth. I was very fortunate in having good friends that got me a job at Nowata. There I was a roustabout, a tool dresser, anything, pipeliner, anything that was to be done. We received the whole sum of $77 a month. Now today, in telling youngsters about that, they don't seem to realize that if you didn't want the job, there were just about a dozen people waiting to grab it all. So somehow or other, we managed to get along. We ate regularly. Of course, we may postpone a meal for a few hours, but it certainly made us realize that the word thrift and saving had a very definite meaning.
Mr. Evans, along about this time, what was your impression of Tulsa and some of the nearby towns?
In the earlier days of the oil business here, the little towns were all about equal. The advantage that Tulsa had over most other places were some aggressive young men who had a vision. Because at the time of statehood, and for a few years, Sapulpa had many advantages over Tulsa. But because of the caliber of man that came and stayed in Tulsa, this became the wonderful city that it is today. Now, as youngsters, we looked on Muskogee as the big place to go if we really wanted to see the sights. But for some reason or other, Muskogee didn't seem to keep pace. May I digress here and tell about my early days in the Osage, when that was the busiest oil field in this section. I think I was 17 at the time when I went out to dress tools for George Stoner. He and his brother Wren had a couple of strings of tools there, what was then Big Heart. the name was later changed to Barnesville because the Barnesville Oil Company put in a refinery at that time, and they wanted the name Big Heart changed to Barnesville. Well, that didn't make much difference in those days because another little town up the way in Osage just adopted the name Big Heart, so we still have that around. Now, life in those days was just a little rough as we have it today, because we had a boarding house, and I recall one day they forgot to get any supplies, and our source of food was rice. We had rice just any way you want it, but that was all. So I have never been too enthusiastic about rice since that time. From the point of the Depression on, it looked a little gloomy, and for those of us who managed to have a little property, we weren't too anxious to have any more because we were concerned about how in the world we'd get enough money to pay the taxes on that which we had. But somehow or other, that time passed, and then we got a little more ambitious, and we wanted land and anything else that we could manage to work and scrape to get a hold of. I recall a wheat field back in the late 40s that had a sign on the barbed wire fence, for sale with a number. Well, I decided that I would investigate and see about buying that. So after inquiring, I found that the 15 acres could be acquired for the sum of $3,000, with $100 down and then the rest of it whenever he could catch me. So through the years, this 15 acres became quite valuable property. It is there on North Peoria, which is across the street from McLean High School. And the rentals that we receive from that keep us out of the poorhouse today.
Mr. Evans, can you remember about what Tulsa was like and Tulsa's war effort in World War II?
I recall very distinctly on Sunday, December the 7th, I had assembled with a group to discuss some gas land that we were going to drill some wells on. Along about noon, somebody had turned on a radio, and the rest of you know what that was, the Jap sneak attack. Well, needless to say, the wells were never drilled, and life was just a little complicated because immediately all tires were frozen. We used stamps for gasoline for all vehicles. Fortunately for me, I had gotten a sprayer in our tree business some few months prior to this time. And having some friends who had charge of the stamps, I always managed to have enough to get by because I had this sprayer. But all people were not that fortunate, and life was certainly curtailed. Those who went through that period will remember the lines that we went through to get stuff that maybe we didn't need or didn't want, but it was something that we could buy. And there were days when we ate all right, but we certainly didn't get the kind of food maybe that we had chosen. But somehow or another, we managed to get through in great shape. Building, of course, was curtailed to a great extent, and the all car models were at the factories were stopped because they were converted to machines of various sorts were winning the war. So to be patriotic, we didn't complain too much about having to go through with the old models that we were caught when this war started. And maybe with going through such periods that some of us have learned to be a little more thrifty and not try to keep up with the way the government runs things today.
Mr. Evans, tell us something about Real Tulsa of today and what you would like to say about the background.
May I add that when we came, there was barely 8,000 population. Our latest census is 330,000. Now, most of this time, with the exception of a few years during the Depression, this has been a steady growth. In fact, from the standpoint of the schools, there has always been a period in which there were little wooden structures to go along with the main building because there was never enough room for all the students to be in the main buildings. As for the growth of the city, the numerous buildings that have been put up have been because people had faith that this was the town of this part of the country. And when you consider that this has been built by so many people from the eastern states, people from the mid-Atlantic, we have many from New England, and with the ideas that have been assimilated with the people who have sold the products that were manufactured here in Tulsa. It is a name that is known throughout the world. We were fortunate this past May in going to Sydney, Australia, to a Rotary convention. And when people would ask where we were from, we would say Tulsa. They knew immediately where it was. So we felt very proud to know that we had come from a section of the country that had been advertised throughout the down under region as well as it had. In the early days, there were a few streets that had been paved. Earlier, the streets were, particularly along First Street, was lined with brick, and that, of course, was a very good base, which later would be paved with asphalt. But to get from here to Sapulpa, was quite an ordeal because all we had was the old macadam road, which disintegrated after a comparatively short period of time. And the road that we know to Sapulpa, which takes a very few minutes, in those early days would take 3 or 4 hours to get there. And of course, having our Turner Turnpike, the Will Rogers Turnpike back to Missouri, the Broken Arrow Expressway, which now we can go down to Interstate 40 and on back to the eastern states, has added so much. So we feel that we are in the very chosen spot of the world.
Mr. Evans, as a lifelong resident of Tulsa, what would you predict for this great city of Tulsa and its future?
I might add, at our green tea breakfast club this morning, we had a speaker who is quite well versed in at our green tea breakfast club this morning, we had a speaker who is quite well versed in the building business. And he said that many people are buying homes in the surrounding towns simply because we don't have enough territory that has the sewer system in as well as the water lines. Now, this may sound a little odd, but to get the bonds voted has always been lagging. I think that in time this will be corrected, at least we hope so that we may retain the population here instead of going, say, to Jenks, Collinsville, Broken Arrow, or even out of the county over to Sapulpa. Be that as may, that is a very healthy sign that it is growing. And of course, with our new waterway, no one has any inkling of how far-reaching that will be in the way of expansion. I have had the opportunity to see what goes on in Houston. I lived in St. Louis, so I know a little about what goes on in the Mississippi, and we often go over in through Tennessee, and I know how Tennessee has progressed because of their waterway there. So we can look at the rock that is thrown in the stream and the ripples. There is no telling what the effect will be for the next few years that this will advance commerce and industry for Tulsa.
We have just had a very delightful interview with Mr. Rex Evans of Tulsa, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, on September the 1st, 1971. This interview was made for the Living Legend Library and the Tulsa Historical Society for the Tulsa State Fair. Your interviewer has been James Katigan, September the 1st, 1971.